Well, welcome. Thanks for joining us for this IEA London YouTube video. My name's Mark Littlewood. I'm the Director General here at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and I'm delighted to be joined by our Economics Fellow and Independent Economist, Julian Jessop. Julian, thanks very much for joining me.
Pleasure.
Now, I'm going to ask you, Julian, to sort out a conundrum for us. Supply chains. What's happening? Why are there shortages? What's going wrong? And I want to start by asking you, what's the scale of the problem here? We're seeing that McDonald's can't sell milkshakes, that there are shortages in other supplies of things that we would usually consider rudimentary goods. Can you just explain to us what's happening, especially at the tail end of the pandemic, not in the midst of it?
Well, the first point to stress is this is very much a global problem. Lots of major economies are running into supply chain difficulties. And that's partly a good news story. The world economy is rebounding more quickly than most people had anticipated, and therefore it's starting to run into capacity constraints, which have been exacerbated by COVID problems on the supply side. So it's partly a global phenomenon. There are lots of good examples of that. The auto sector, for example, has been hit by a shortage of computer chips. So electronic components have gone missing. That led to a pretty sharp fall in car production in the UK in July, but other countries have seen their car production drop off sharply as well. Driver shortages also a very big issue, but one that is global as well. So the international trade organizations that monitor the road transport industry have been warning about a shortage of drivers for some time, partly because conditions in the industry are so poor that people are looking for alternative jobs. So if you look in the US or the German media, you actually see pretty much the same stories about shortages of drivers as we have here, including big dollar and euro bonuses being offered to attract them. It does seem to be the case that there are more reports of problems in the food supply chain in the UK. I think that does need to be taken seriously, particularly in the run up to Christmas. Some of those problems might increase. But for now, at least, a lot of the headlines still seem to be exaggerated. If you look at what the retailers themselves are saying, they're still talking about isolated cases and some disruption. It might be that some items are in short supply, but they're covered by increases in other items. So I still think it's wrong to talk about widespread shortages of food or empty shelves. But there is undoubtedly a concern there that I think we do need to take seriously, and there are some reasons to think the problems there could get worse.
Okay, can I just parcel out what you've said there? Do you think, if you like, the problem insofar as there is one, is that demand has bounced back rather faster than people might have been expecting? So there are more people wanting McDonald's milkshakes than McDonald's thought there would be at this time of year because they feared there would still be lockdown or whatever. Is that, if you like, insofar as there is a problem, it's that demand is heavier, in which case supply is just going to catch up. Is that the nature of it? Because this is a very unusual problem, right? That McDonald's to run out of milk, this is pretty peculiar. And is it just that actually a good news story, as you said, that its demand is racing ahead much faster than we could possibly have expected? This is a bit like, I don't know, there being queues around the block for the next blockbuster movie, not everybody can get in, or queues around the block for the latest Xbox, not everybody will get one. Is it that? Is that demand is much higher than we thought? Or is it that supply chains are more fragile than we thought?
Well, nearly, but not quite. I mean, it's not as if there's been a sudden surge in demand for, milkshakes at McDonald's or chicken at Nando's. The way the problem is showing itself up is that the labour market in general is very tight. So for a number of reasons, including, by the way, the government's furlough scheme, which is locking some people into jobs rather than encourage them to find new ones. So there's a shortage of labour generally. Now, that happens to be showing up more in some sectors than others. For example, in HGV drivers, mainly actually because of the impact of the pandemic. So lots of people have left the profession. HGV drivers tend to be relatively old. Average age is something like 55, but they've not been replaced by newly qualified drivers because they've not been able to take training and tests as usual. So the way the demand problem is showing up is through a lack of basically people to drive the milkshakes to McDonald's. And what lots of companies like McDonald's have done is decided to cut back on the sort of high volume items. So it might be harder to get, big bottles of fizzy water or something from a supermarket, and instead focus on the things that people need a bit more, the higher value items, including actually basic food products as well. So that's how the problem has shown itself through. But to some extent, you're right. It is a symptom of strong demand in the economy. It's noticeable that those economies that have seen faster economic growth over the last few months, including the US and the UK, seem to have far bigger supply problems than, for example, Japan or Australia, where the recoveries have been much weaker. So to an extent, this is a symptom of a nice problem to have, which is labour shortages. But of course, that's no consolation if you desperately want that milkshake or your Nando's chicken.
And how quickly could we expect, Julian, the market to correct this? So HGV drivers being on the low end, I mean, my sort of assumption would be market pricing should just click back into play. If you were an HGD driver who retired 2 years ago, surely if we were trying to get milk into McDonald's or whatever else, we should just offer you double your salary to start driving trucks around again. Why isn't there an almost instantaneous market response to this? If the problem is a lack of lorry drivers, you would have thought that could have been brought on stream incredibly quickly just by the price mechanism, no?
Well, a lot of that is, of course, already happening. So, lots of employers are paying, bumper bonuses to attract drivers. But there are also some problems that the markets can't fix. So the market can't magically conjure up more tests for drivers to take. So the government has to do something there. It needs to sort of put more resources into allowing more people to take driving tests and qualify for the first time. There are probably other things that the government needs to do, addressing things like visa problems and so on. To allow the markets to recruit more people from overseas to fill temporary shortages. So the market can go a long way, and what we're seeing is an adjustment in relative wages and prices to shift resources from sectors where they're needed less towards those where they're needed more. But the government still needs to do a lot, I think, to help markets work properly. I touched earlier on the furlough scheme as well. I mean, we're talking about maybe tens of thousands of people are missing because of Brexit, but there's 1 million, maybe 2 million people on furlough at the moment who potentially could be contributing to easing these labour shortages, but at the moment they're not.
So help me with this. If there is a problem at the moment, question A, how quickly will we rebound back? Is this a catastrophe? Or I think it's the head of Tesco's has said, John Allen, that we should stop over-dramatising this. Okay, maybe you can't get your favourite banana milkshake at McDonald's this week, but in a few weeks' time you'll be able to. Is this going to be a short correction, which we don't really need to worry about? That's question A. Question B is, if you like, who's to blame? And so often we say, I know you've been commenting on this on social media, that the people who wanted Britain to remain in the EU are blaming Brexit, other people will be blaming COVID, or I guess my instinctive prejudicial reaction is to blame the over-regulation of lorry drivers, so there aren't enough to come to market because you've got too many tests and too much red tape. How big a problem is it? Is it a very short-term thing? We won't even be discussing this in a fortnight's time. And insofar as it's been a problem, who are you pointing the finger of blame at?
Well, on the first point, I'm known for watching the incoming data like a hawk. And interestingly, the latest evidence in the retail sector is that overall retail sales are actually booming. There was a CBI survey that suggested that despite the supply problems, there's a massive increase in sales in August. So if there are problems, they are still clearly pretty local. Some of the specific problems we know are already easing. So the peak of the pandemic is past, and more people are able to go back to work as that crisis lifts. So there are some sort of short-term reasons for optimism. And in the longer term, obviously, the more time the markets have to adjust, the smaller the problem is going to be as well. So I remain relatively optimistic. On who's to blame, I think the Remainers, in a sense, have a bit of a point here. I don't think there's any reason why you necessarily had to have these problems as a result of Brexit, but the way that Brexit has been done, I think, has made some of the problems bigger than they needed to be. I mean, I think it seems bizarre that we haven't relaxed the visa requirements, at least temporarily, for people like HGV drivers. And also in sectors like the poultry industry, we've always been very dependent on, basically seasonal workers coming over here. And, in the run up to Christmas, there might be two reasons for shortage of turkeys. One is not enough lorry drivers to drive them to the shops, but also not enough turkeys in the first place because there aren't people working on the farms to produce them. So I think there is a good case for the government relaxing some of the rules there. It may be reluctant to do so because it could be perhaps politically embarrassing. It sort of admits that free movement does produce some benefits for the UK economy. It might also be that the judgment is that there's something like 5 million EU citizens have applied for settled or pre-settled status here. So there's no shortage of people who still have the right to live and work here if required. We don't necessarily need to change the visa system. But whatever it is, I think there is possibly a bit more that the government could do. And as you say, it's largely about reducing the additional red tape and lowering the red tape that existed already, rather than necessarily saying it's Brexit itself that's the root cause of everything.
What's really interesting here, Julian, is do you think that the government should intervene on immigration on a sector by sector approach? We haven't got enough poultry workers, so if you're a chicken farmer, you can get in more easily. We haven't got enough lorry drivers, so if you're a lorry driver, you can get in more easily. NHS, key workers, whatever, we might bring them in more easily. Do you think the government should, if you like, start picking winners, or in this case, picking losers and trying to convert them into winners sector by sector? Or should our immigration approach be along the lines of, if you've got a job offer of, I don't know, £30,000 per annum or above, you're in. We don't care whether you're a poultry worker or an HGV driver or an NHS nurse. We're just going to look at the price. Or do you think the government is going to change immigration policy by sector, by actually saying these are the people we'll let in at perhaps lower salaries than we would allow in if you're a footballer or a performer or a barman or a barmaid?
Well, I think none of those solutions are really satisfactory. I mean, I don't like the idea either that civil servants should decide that job A is somehow more valuable than job B. I'm also not enthusiastic about some sort of salary limit because it's often people that might be earning only, say, £20,000 who are actually the most important. Monetary value doesn't always equate to your importance to the economy or society. My own preference, actually, funny enough, would be to go back a bit more towards what we had before, so some form of free movement, not necessarily the EU model, but something far more flexible than that. But if we are going to have rules in place, I think they need to be far more adaptable than they seem to be at the moment. And the government needs to be flexible. And when it is told by a major industry like the poultry industry or the HGV industry that there is a significant problem here that more flexible visa rules would deal with, then it does seem odd to me that the government isn't willing to respond.
Do you think we could have our cake and eat it here in Brexit Britain, Julian, that we could actually say, let's bring back free movement for labour, but if you like, not free movement for welfare? A common plea, I think it was partly because of the bad design of the British welfare system rather than because of the European Union itself, but a common plea was the danger is if you allow free movement, you get welfare immigration, not work immigration. Could the UK government say, by all means, come in. We don't care whether you're Bulgarian, Polish or anything else, become a poultry farmer or labourer in a farm, become an HGV worker, that's fine. But you're not getting, the NHS, housing benefit, education for your children, or the rest of it. Welfare is limited to the indigenous population. But if you want to come here to work, just sign on the dotted line and you're in.
Yeah, again, that is tricky though, because arguably, if you are living and working here and contributing to society and paying your taxes, why wouldn't you be eligible for healthcare and welfare benefits as well? So again, I think there isn't really an easy answer here. I will say, as a free marketeer, I personally am relatively relaxed about the free movement of people. I think that there's overwhelming evidence that the economic benefits offset the costs. Equally, though, I do understand why it's potentially a difficult political issue. Even if there are economic benefits, there might be broader issues in terms of overcrowding, pressure on the housing supply, pressure on the NHS, whatever else it might be. Now, of course, migrants are often the people who are tackling those very problems, but I understand why unlimited migration would not be acceptable, and that some sorts of limits need to be put in place. But if we do have limits, I think they need to be sensible and proportionate. and not counterproductive for the economy and for British consumers in the way that some of the current rules are.
Now, help me on the immigration thing. I read your piece on CapEx, which we'll link to in the show notes below. You were suggesting, and I think Jonathan Portes would agree with you here, that actually immigration hasn't lowered wages because there's the lump of labour fallacy. If the population doubles, there are more jobs, there's more demand. It's not obvious that workers are paid less. There's a more dynamic and fluid element in the labour market. But would it not be the case overall, if you tighten immigration rules, if you make it harder for a Polishman or a Bulgarian woman to come and be an HGV driver or a poultry farmer, that generally the price of labour will go up? So are we expecting, because we're restricting immigration, because free movement has ended, and you can argue whether this is good or bad, but wouldn't the rational economic view be that wages will increase as a result? Obviously that will feed then through into prices. But is that what's going to happen?
Well, it's possible. I don't think it will. I think what will happen is that relative wages will rise in those sectors where there are shortages, but that won't necessarily have a huge impact on the overall level of wages. But even if it does, then actually you've touched on what I think is the key point, is that this would be the wrong sort of wage inflation. Because it's not reflected in higher productivity, then those wage increases probably would be reflected in higher prices. And as a result, real wages, so allowing for the fact that the price level is higher, won't in fact have improved. And if there are circumstances where, for whatever reason, companies can't pass on those price increases, then they're going to respond in other ways, including cutting supply and ultimately cutting jobs as well. So sort of artificially limiting the supply of something will tend to increase the price. But in this case, I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. It's much better to ensure that people are paid more because they're more productive in some way. And there's overwhelming evidence that, free trade, lower trade barriers is positive for productivity and therefore for the real wages, including of local workers.
Now, Julian, you've been, I think it's fair to say, in the round quite optimistic about the economy in the UK and globally bouncing back quite quickly from the pandemic. It's been a kind of artificial, indeed deliberate recession in some way. We deliberately reduced GDP in order to combat this health problem. And you've been, I think, in the round quite confident and optimistic that the bounce back ability of the UK economy and the global economy at large will be shown to be robust. Are you in any way downgrading your projections there, or do you think that we can still be very optimistic that now we're presumably in the tail end of fighting the pandemic, that actually we'll make up lost ground extremely quickly and will grow from there at a normal, decent rate?
No, I'm still optimistic. I still think, for example, that the level of economic activity, in other words, GDP, will be back to pre-COVID levels, within a month or two of now, which is a good year, maybe 2 years earlier than most people anticipated. And also some of the longer term problems that people were worried about. For example, a permanent increase in unemployment, lots of structural issues there. I think those concerns have faded. The unemployment numbers have continued to be a lot better than expected. Even actually the public finance numbers, borrowing and debt have been coming in lower than anticipated, basically because the economy has been stronger. And as we know, a stronger economy is the best way to get the burden of debt down. So I still think there are far more reasons to be optimistic than pessimistic, but there are concerns. I think inflation is a valid concern, partly, as I say, because we're starting to run into capacity constraints. I also get worried that the government is going to get hooked on spending enormous amounts of money forever. I mean, it had to spend more during the pandemic, but that shouldn't be a model for more normal times, but some people think it should be. So are there some longer term risks, but I think the bulk of what's happened over the last few months has still been pretty encouraging.
Okay, and then let's finish by your prescription, if you will. You can be optimistic or pessimistic, and you're on the slightly optimistic side, I guess, as an observer and an analyst who goes through all of the data. But what would your recommendation be to the UK government to double down on that optimism? To completely rescind all of the things that are going wrong, to supercharge the things that are going right? What changes in public policy would you like to see to ensure that you're mild optimism becomes extreme optimism, and that growth, employment,
Yeah.
prosperity really flourishes in the next 5 or 10 years?
Well, three things. First of all, I think the government should stop pumping money into an economy that is already running into capacity constraints. And by the government there, I'm including the Bank of England, where I think it should end quantitative easing sooner rather than later. The problems in the economy at the moment are now largely on the supply side, not demand. So inflating things even further doesn't make any sense. The second point is that the government should look for ways to allow markets to work more normally again. Now COVID restrictions are being lifted. There's little case for lots of forms of state intervention that were necessary a year ago, but no longer necessary now. So I think the government's absolutely right, for example, to start to scale back the furlough scheme and encourage people to move on to new jobs or go back to work with their existing employer. And then the third thing is sort of relentless focus on economic growth. And given that the growth problems in this economy are not really on the demand side anymore, this is more about boosting the supply side. So, it's things like sensible infrastructure investment. They're probably a lot less than the government currently is planning to do, but also reforms to taxation, which generally, of course, means lower taxes, not higher. It means pressing ahead with changes to planning laws and all the sorts of things that are the free market ways to boost the supply side of the economy, to make sure that the rebounding growth isn't just a result of stimulus, but it becomes embedded in the whole economy, including the private sector.
And do you detect, Julian, on those points on tax and regulation, that there's any either political or intellectual appetite to go down that route? You might take the view, you used to be a senior person at the Treasury, that the Treasury's view is just going to be, well, we've spent so much, the deficit is still high, there's no way we can lower taxes unless we're absolutely certain they're on the wrong side of the Laffer curve. We just don't have the headroom to do that. We've got a huge bill to pay back. On regulation, I've seen today that the government might depart from EU regulation on cookie pop-ups on websites. More power to their elbow, but it's not obvious to me that that's the sort of deregulation that will completely supercharge growth. It will merely remove a minor inconvenience for consumers of a tiny, tiny amount. Do you think that either lower tax or lower regulation is politically, or is the intellectual climate such that either of those could actually be delivered in the coming years?
Well, certainly the intellectual climate is tough for those ideas at the moment. There's overwhelming evidence that people, like the idea that the government can do enormous amounts because it did enormous amounts during the pandemic, arguably with lots of success. And I think there will be a tussle actually over the next few years between different parts of the government. I think clearly the Prime Minister, number 10, is keener on sort of populist spending pledges than the Treasury would ever be. So there are lots of battles that are going to be fought. However, we can point to other countries, including the US, for example, which is continuing with this sort of agenda of massive amounts of spending to no obvious benefit apart from significantly higher inflation. Inflation in the US is already 5% and could still go higher still. So we at least have examples to point to of where massive amount of state intervention, when it's no longer needed, can be counterproductive. So it is going to be a difficult argument to win, but as ever, difficult arguments are the ones that are probably worth taking on the most.
And let me just finish by asking you this then, Julian. Do you think these present supply side problems that consumers and producers are witnessing, a mild bump in the road, we'll get over this in the next, few weeks, couple of months, and the future is rosy? Or are there some systemic problems that really concern you about the longer term bounce back from the COVID pandemic?
There are some longer term problems that worry me, but it isn't these disruptions. I think these disruptions almost certainly are temporary. Some of the problems, for example, the pandemic are already fading. And if they do continue for a bit longer, there's still things that the industry and government itself can do to correct them. So I think there are some much bigger, longer term issues, but I would be surprised if we're still talking about these issues that we are today in, say, 4 weeks' time.
Julian, it's always a pleasure to speak to you. Thanks very much for your tempered, intelligent and forensic optimism, which is always an absolute delight to hear. Thanks to all of you for watching. Thanks especially to those of you who donate to the IEA. If you'd like to keep us on air, then do please consider becoming an IEA patron. by going to patreon.com/IEA London. We'll put a note in that below. Do check out Julian's article on CapEx. That will also be in the show notes. Thanks very much for joining us. See you again soon. Over and out.